So thanks, Arthur. Take it away.
Thanks.
And before you start, sorry, we are seeing like your,
Oh,
yeah,
yes. Uh,
the slide deck.
that right?
That looks perfect. And I'll just say, if you have questions, pop them in the chat and I'll try to facilitate the Q&A and so interrupt Arthur at the right time. So feel free to just pop questions in the chat and then I'll coordinate those. Thanks.
Great. Yes, like Sue said, I'm Arthur Siller and I'm going to be talking about cover crops today. My info is here on this slide, and I'll have it again at the end. But if anybody wants to reach out, if you have questions that we don't get to today, or any, um, yeah, anything that comes up, I'm happy to talk about cover crops and other soil health related stuff for for vegetables or other crops. So I was a organic vegetable farmer for about a decade before coming to UMass, and excited to talk about this stuff today. So I think probably most people are familiar with cover crops who are here today to some extent, but there is, can be a little bit sometimes the definitions of what cover crops are. Some people have different sort of ideas about exactly what is a cover crop and what is, a cash crop that does good stuff for your field. So, I like to think of a cover crop as being anything that you're growing that's primarily for, sort of farm ecological benefits or future benefits of any kind. So, like for example, vegetable farms, it's totally possible to harvest some radishes from your radish cover crop and get beautiful radishes, and that doesn't make it not a cover crop. A lot of farmers will harvest hay or straw from cover crops, which can be a great way to get clean straw if that's something that you want, is to grow it yourself as part of your cover crop rotation. So really quickly before we get into more details, just a few, this is probably a review for a lot of folks, but kind of what are a bunch of the things that cover crops do. And fundamentally what they're doing is you're getting that sun energy into living things, which can then cycle around in the ecology. So capturing more sunlight, they're going to stop weed growth while the cover crops are there. They're going to recycle soil nitrogen, and we'll get into a little bit of the different ways that can be producing nitrogen if they're a legume, or preventing nitrogen from leaching for other crops. You're going to add organic matter, which is really key to the functioning of the soil. You have beneficial insect habitat and protect the soil from erosion. And I've got this picture here of a badly eroded field, which that's terrible. They're going to improve the soil structure, reduce environmental pollution, both through leaching and runoff, and support the soil microbiology through there. But, they're not perfect. And so, you generally are not directly making your money back on the cover crops. I have a question mark on the can't sell them part here because, like depends on what it is. Sometimes you might harvest some of the cover crops and sell them. They can be cover crops, or they can be pest habitat for, so that's going to come especially with vegetables. That's going to be something with Nebraska cover crops, that it's going to be something that you want to think about. It's definitely management complexity, and there's seed and labor costs involved in cover cropping. So for instance, and I just have this picture here of a field of lamb's quarters to say, nobody had to do anything to get that lamb's quarter to grow. You didn't have to seed it, you didn't have to do any labor. And this is also a little bit of a reminder that, there you can get some of there was a question that came in over the email about, are there, sort of native plants that can serve some of the same purposes as cover crops? And I would say, like, as long as you're careful about the seed production from weeds, you can get some of the same sort of benefits from cover crops in some circumstances that you get by not being too aggressive on weeds. Anyway, so we're going to start by talking about the transitions, and we're going to talk a lot about transitions between cash crops and cover crops today, because that's really that's like the tricky stuff. Once you have your cover crop planted, then it just grows and it grows there. And then once knowing when to plant your cover crop, when to kill your cover crop, how that relates to your cash crop is kind of the big stumbling block with cover cropping. And mostly today I'm going to be talking about winter cover crops, not exclusively, but they're really the main thing that people are using, because we don't have a lot of cash crops that can be grown in the late fall and early spring, especially for vegetables in the super early spring. We do have with vegetables a number of things that are staying in the field until the late fall. But we'll talk about ways that you can still cover crop those fields as well today. And yeah, there are a number of cover crops that do really well during that time of the year. So to get a little bit more into what I mean by like the transitions being complicated, is that there's really no clean slate to start with. The cover crop is going to affect the cash crop that comes after it. The cash crop is going to affect the cover crop that comes after it. It's really hard to, especially on like a diversified vegetable farm, it's going to be really hard to plan that out in a perfect way then the weather is going to go perfectly right and everything is going to go according to plan. So, cover cropping is, to get the most out of cover cropping, it takes, a fair amount of juggling stuff around. In the same way that you're, juggling around where the cash crops are going, you end up having to do that with the cover crops as well. And, so one thing that people might say is, isn't just not having a cover crop more flexible? And it is in some ways, but it's really going to limit the productivity of the farm. And, I'm not sure precisely what different people certifying agencies are going to say from an organic perspective. But the organic standards say you have to maintain sort of the organic matter in your soil as you continue growing. And that's going to be really, really hard without cover cropping. I think it is something that, from an organic perspective, whether you're absolutely required to by your certifying agency or not, it's really something that is basically a requirement. And I would say most of the flexibility is needed in the spring when, getting those cash crops in. That's, really important. And knowing, how to manage cover crops to hit your planting windows is going to be important. So we're going to talk about kind of 3 different ways of looking at cover crop planting today. The cash crop growing season, the different cover crop windows, and then also the different cover crop terminations. And these are all different ways that you can look at cover crops that are going to be like pretty effective, and they kind of will go together. We'll look at a bunch of common cover crops, and we'll also look at kind of some try and go through some hypothetical situations that maybe what's on your farm now or things you're thinking about toward the end today. So I started with the cash crop growing season because that's usually where people start from. People have cash crops they want to grow, and you want to figure out what cover crops can I fit around this. And one of the things that's, it's pretty doable to just plant rye whenever your fall cash crops come out, and go in and till that up in the spring, 3 weeks, 4 weeks before you're going to plant. But you're really not going to get as much out of the cover crops as with a little bit more energy put into the planting. So, but the transitions are, so we're gonna kind of start with some different types of windows that would come from the cash crop growing season. So if you have a late crop going in the fall, so here we're talking about something that's not coming out of the field until maybe the beginning or middle of October. And in this case, you're going to be limited to really cold tolerant cover crops. You're pretty much out on anything that's going to winter kill. It's not going to, like anything that's not cold tolerant enough to make it through the winter is really going to grow in that late fall. And so, some options that might be better if you really need that field first thing in the spring would be to do like a straw mulch out there, or depending on how it fits in with your like pest and disease management, to leave crop residues in the field until the spring. In some cases, you don't want to leave those crop residues out there because they are going to be a habitat for pests and diseases. And to some extent, the later you go, a heavier seeding rate can really make up for a later planting date for cover crops. And I've just got lots of pictures of cover crops on all these slides. So if somebody has a question about one of the pictures, pop that in the chat, and I'm happy to answer questions as we go if people have them in the chat, or to talk at the end. So don't worry about interrupting me, I guess. So, if you have a cash crop that's coming out earlier, so say something that's coming out in August, then you have a lot more options for cover crops that can go in. A lot of winter kill cover crops can go in at that time, and crops that are going to grow a lot in the fall. So there you've got your radishes, oats, like a spring pea, lots of stuff that'll be really vigorous in the fall and put on a lot of growth, but you won't end up with any sort of seed production from that. So one option when we get into the late planting is to do interseeding. And that can be, an option to plant a winter kill cover crop in, a later cash crop, or something where if you have a crop that's not coming out until early November, to get some sort of cover crop in there before it becomes too late. And we'll see what happens with the climate over the next few years, but even if it gets significantly warmer, there just really isn't enough light once we get into November to get good cover crop growth in that fall. Even on warm days, we don't see a lot of growth. So interseeding can allow you to get those plants started, kind of an overlap the cash and cover crops. And generally the cover crop's going to be planted whenever your last cultivation is. And you need to think about how much traffic's going to go on there. A lot of stuff is not so tolerant to traffic, but grasses and clovers will do all right. It's quite difficult to get an even cover crop stand doing interseeding because of the just the difference in shade and how well you can work in everything. So now we're going to look at the other end of the year, and we're going to look at the cash crop planting time and think about how that affects your cover crop planting. So if you have something that's going in early, so maybe it's onions, a spring brassica, radishes, or something like that, that you're trying to get in as early as possible. The easiest thing to have is a winter cover in that sort of situation. So you don't have, one of the issues with winter kill cover crops is that you have a long window in the spring where you're not getting that solar radiation captured by the cover crops or cash crops. But if you're going in early anyways, and this is a situation where tarping can be a useful thing to both warm up the soil in the spring and to dry it out and to, kind of kill any little remnants of crops when you want to get in there early, if tarping is something folks are interested in. And that can work for if you have time for some overwintering cover crops. You can also, I've heard from some farmers that there's some of the winter kill cover crops aren't dying as much as people were expecting them to. And, if tarping is something that you have the capacity for, that can be a way for those early fields that you really wanted to get into fast, where it's still too wet to till and don't have a lot of other options for how to get rid of that on an organic farm for sure.
Arthur, can I ask a question here?
Definitely.
I think you said you were going to talk about some of the different species towards the end, but just maybe real quick, what are some of the common winter kill cover crops?
I would say the most common are oats, spring peas, and I see, but there's, there are other, as far as like there's other things that will winter kill, like buckwheat, but people don't tend to grow that as much leading up to the fall. But a number of brassica crops will winter kill, but not all brassica crops. Some of the mustards will make it through. So
okay. There was
through the
another
winter.
question about
Yeah.
do cover crops that are aggressive self-seeders pose problems for these seasonal transitions?
So I would say they can. I think they tend to be more of an issue on conventional farms that aren't relying on cultivation for weed control. Most of the self-seeding cover crops are easier to control than your annual weeds. And so you'll generally cultivate them out pretty easily with uh, with the regular weed control. You definitely will end up I think it's pretty common to have cover crop volunteers in the headlands, especially where you don't have as good weed control generally. But I think when you start having reduced tillage, you definitely can run into issues. People have that, especially with vetch, that can be, a couple rye plants is not that big of a thing, but a vetch plant can get pretty large. And so that's actually something where it's both the self-seeding, and one of the issues with the vetch is that it has a fairly high amount of hard seed, and so it can pop up later on, whereas the rye will kind of mostly germinate, honestly, kind of when you might be seeding your next rye cover crop. But if you're having cover crops self-seeding, buckwheat is probably the one that I would worry about the most. But staying on top of the cultivation is the best way. With something like buckwheat, it's going to be quite tricky not to get some viable seeds, just because they ripen their seeds progressively as opposed to some of the other crops.
Okay, thanks.
Um, so next we'll sort of talk about like if you have a sort of late spring cash crop planting. So, like this is where you aren't maybe getting as much out of a winter kill cover crop as you would otherwise from a, sunlight capturing standpoint. But, a lot of those winter kill cover crops still have a decent amount of dead residue that will, it's not like a tilled soil. It's not going to leave the field as vulnerable to erosion or runoff, even with the residues being dead. And yeah, again, like tarps can be a great way to dry out the soil, especially on a smaller scale. If you're in the several acres range, tarps can be a really effective way to do spring stuff. They don't really have large scale systems for rolling out tarps available yet that I've seen, at least. Seems to be something that works on it for a couple acres. And typically at this point, a single killing cover crops is fairly easy. You're not having to deal with really, really big spring cover crops yet by the early May, I guess. I guess we'll see as things get warmer. Maybe we will be dealing with those in early May. So when we get into our late plantings into very end of May and early June, this is when we start seeing it become viable for people to use roller crimpers and sort of do some of the experimental no-till organic methods that are still being sort of developed for that. And this is, I would say, when you're going to get, and at this point, you're in the range where you could have a spring cover crop that you plant and still have it be worthwhile. If you go in and plant oats and peas in April, or early April, say, you're going to get a lot of growth from that. You still have range for planting fall brassicas or, a later, a later crop. Fall brassica are what's coming to mind for me that would go in like late June. For most of these methods, you are going to want, several weeks from at minimum from killing the cover crops to planting your cash crops as well. So we've sort of touched on this a little bit, but we're going to sort of talk about the different things that you can do in the different cover crop windows. So we have our fall cover crop window, our spring cover crop window, and you can kind of combine those into like a winter cover crop window, as well as summer cover crops, and then like a full season. And there's kind of different goals and how to use these windows effectively, depending on what your cash crops are and how much land you have. So there's lots of things to think about there for how you use these windows effectively. So in the fall, our goals of cover cropping in the fall are mostly to capture nutrients that are left over in the soil, particularly nitrogen. Anything that's left over, anything that's still coming out of breaking down organic matter over that fall, to keep that in the organic cycle. We want to get some biomass, some living roots, some leaves protecting the soil from raindrop impacts, and we want to sort of improve the soil structure and tilth by getting the sunlight energy into the soil, by having the roots feed the microbes, all that sort of stuff. You're encouraging, most cover crops are going to form relationships with mycorrhizae and be sort of feeding all the beneficial microbes in there. And again, if you're planting in early November, which is like you're basically planting a spring cover crop. You're not going to get much out of that. And you want to increase the cover crop seeding rate to get the same effect the later you go. Because like a rye plant, for instance, isn't going to have as many shoots if you plant it in late October as in early September, mid-September. So in the spring,
Arthur,
our main goals are going to be getting
can I
organic
interrupt you
matter.
for a second, Arthur?
Oh, yeah.
Sorry. I just and you might get to this and you kind of alluded to it a few times about warming, changing climate. Do you
Yep.
know, are there people working on updated seeding timelines? Like I feel like there was like you can plant rye until September 15th, but what is that date now? October 15th,
Um,
November 15th?
it's not, I would say it's the end of October, but I would start going heavier seeding rates after the middle of October. So yeah, there are um like I'll talk a little bit about it, but there's kind of a Northeast cover crop working group that does sort of compiles information from ongoing research and tries to incorporate that into uh, recommendations. But it is, they are general recommendations. I would say, you want to ideally the middle of October for rye, and I would say end of September for most other things.
Okay.
Would be kind of the later dates given what we've seen
Okay.
more
Thank you.
recently. Definitely later frosts, definitely warmer, and we'll see if this year is typical going forward, then things might be really different 5 years from now as far as the recommendations. Um,
Okay. Thanks.
so yeah. Um, so in the spring, you're going to get a lot more growth, even at similar temperatures than the fall, because you've got a lot more light in the spring. And so that ends up being a really great window to add a lot of organic matter to the soil. If you see a big field of rye, you see like an overwintered mustard, vetch, all these things get really get big once we start getting a lot of light and reasonable temperatures in May. Uh, and for most of the biennial legumes that you're going to get, this is going to be your window on like to get a lot of nitrogen fixation. So from vetch or overwintered pea, crimson clover, it's the spring that's going to be the time that you get most of the nitrogen fixation from those legumes. And late termination is kind of what you need to get to, vetch is going to really be at the end of May before you start seeing really high nitrogen fixation and see, it kind of flowering up there. To get the maximum nitrogen fixation, you want to wait until the legumes are pretty vigorously flowering. But it can be a lot of nitrogen. So it's definitely worth thinking about if you can put off, planting something for a week if you've got a good, and this is again where flexibility comes in. You might look at a field in the middle of May and say, oh, this one, my vetch didn't do that well. I'm not gonna get that much out of this anyways. I'm gonna move what I was gonna plant another field to here because I'm gonna terminate this earlier. Whereas another field has a great stand of vetch or crimson clover, and I really want to let that go a little bit later. Which then, start running into all sorts of other crop rotation issues and everything else. It's all a big dance. So next we'll look at summer and, summer cover crops. Generally, we've been getting a lot more big storms. And so having that bare soil for a month and a half in the summer it's really a risk. And wanting to have something out there that is going to have some roots in holding the soil and stopping the raindrops from hitting the soil. Every time a raindrop hits the soil, you get, all the little bits of soil get loosened and broken off of the aggregates, and are then both those little bits can clog up the pores in the soil so that you then get worse infiltration of the rain, and they're all loose and available to erode right off, which is a big disaster. And you also, again, have a lot of light in the summer. You can get a lot of growth from summer cover crops. And, even buckwheat or Sudan grass can really get in there. I would say on vegetable farms, it's not a super common window, but it is. So it's something you can think of, how do I combine a summer cover crop window if I'm not going to be planting in this, say it's a garlic field and I'm going to be planting it, garlic's coming out, and then it's a little bit early to plant a fall cover crop right away. Do I want to plant buckwheat for a month or a month and a half and then plant my winter cover crop? But you can kind of combine it with that pretty easily. So when we start looking at full season fallows, there's a lot of options that aren't really there and aren't super productive. As they're not, there's a lot of crops that are really good for your farm that don't grow super quickly the first 3 or 4 months that they're alive. And so this is, I would say, something where you start looking at a lot of clovers, and you can get some really nice results from red clover if you have a year to put it into. And that's a great thing to pair a slower growing cover crop with a fast nurse crop that's going to maybe winter kill and then leave your clover field. Then briefly, I'm going to touch on permanent living mulches, which are still a area of really ongoing area of research. It's kind of what everyone would like, is to have the soil protected all the time, to be capturing all the solar energy. Ideally with a legume, it's making nitrogen right there. And so the goals are to have high agricultural production without, in kind of a permanent ecosystem of full plant cover. But people have some luck with this in different, using different methods, but we haven't really gotten there as far as keeping up our high production goals that we associate with tillage agriculture, whether that's because our varieties aren't bred for this type of production, or we haven't bred the cover crops to work right. But something to keep your eye on. In the long run, we might be in a really different place 10, 20 years from now, where this sort of system is really viable. And if it's something you're interested in, there are lots of farmer networks and people experimenting on little stuff to try and figure out how to do this sort of thing. So I want to talk a little bit here about planting methods as well, which is basically our 3 kind of, I guess I would say this section is essentially my sales pitch for drilling your cover crops, as opposed to broadcasting. But and frost seeding is possible, but not terribly common for vegetable fields. I would say the timing isn't great. And again, we'll talk about interseeding. So the advantages of broadcast seeding is that the equipment is really affordable. If you're on a small scale, you can do it with a bucket. And if you're on a large scale, like a cone spreader is in the hundreds of dollars, not the many thousands of dollars. If certainly if you find a used one. And you know, when broadcast seeding is successful, you get a really nice even stand because it's not planted in rows. It's going to be spread out more evenly. And that can be like all things being equal, that's better than having things in rows and having the soil in between the rows exposed. I would say broadcasting is more weather dependent than than drilling. It's harder to get that seed soil contact with broadcasting. You need a little bit looser soil of some sort. Whether that's a little bit of a harrow. It doesn't need to be totally tilled, but it does need to be like pretty loose to get in there.
Can I ask a
Just
noob
to, uh,
question?
yeah.
A total noob question. Would you recommend tilling before broadcasting or after?
Um, it kind of depends on what's there. If essentially you need to get the seeds under a little bit of soil for them to, for most cover crops, half an inch to an inch maybe of soil on top of them so that it doesn't wash off because if they're broadcast, they're just going to be sort of sitting there until it rains, basically. Um, and so I think that depending on kind of how much crop residue, how hard it is, I think it's the sort of thing that a harrow sort of step. You don't want to do a big tillage afterwards, so you wouldn't want to like go over it with a disc because I think you'd end up getting a lot of the seeds too deep. But like a tine harrow sort of thing, lightly on the end can be effective, but I think a lot of folks will have, if you harrowed it ahead of time and then broadcast and then go over with a brilliant, that'll get you a nice stand. If there's there's a lot of old brilliants out there. That's a fairly easy piece of equipment, and that'll get stuff in there
Okay,
enough for emergence.
thanks.
Um, so drills are great. They really get good and fast germination. It's totally possible with broadcasting to broadcast and then it not to rain for a week and a half, and for your cover crop that you thought you planted on time to not really be on time anymore. And with a drill, even you get much better emergence. But drills are really expensive. And that's, I would say, alleviated to some extent of the conservation districts. I know Hampton Hampshire Conservation District and Berkshire Conservation District both have drills that they sort of rent for a nominal at cost, I guess. You have to take some time to get it for you, but they have that available for farmers essentially to do cover cropping. And they're really nice pieces of equipment that you can get. Goes pretty quick. But it is the sort of thing that is it's a big investment of time for cover cropping. Although you definitely get a nice stand. So just to touch a little bit on frost seeding, even though it probably won't come up, it's basically you can, if you put the seed out there when the ground is freezing and thawing, the movement of the ground will open up little cracks that the seeds can fall into. And it can work really well for small round seeds, which is basically clover. I think it would work okay for brassicas as well. But you have to time it like just right, is you have to get out there during the time of year when things are freezing and thawing, which can also be a really muddy time of year. It's quite effective for kind of overseeding pastures where you really don't want to do any tillage, but it's not super useful for vegetables. But I'm just including it here in case folks have heard about that and think about it. It's certainly a possibility of something to try. And so to talk a little bit more about interseeding, the idea here is that you plant your cover crop already before the cash crop is harvested. And the cover crop grows considerably slower when you interseed. So, if you have a cover crop that you normally would plant, say the end of August, like a brassica cover crop or oats or something, you say this would do great at the end of August. If you interseed it at the end of August, you're not going to get the kind of growth that you would get from planting it normally. So, you get a lot of leggy cover crops when they're interseeded, and they grow pretty slowly. Which is kind of what you want, because if you have a really vigorous cover crop, you can get a lot of competition with your cash crop, which is and you really can't. So the timing of interseeding is a little bit tricky. And I would say that's something it's something to try, but be realistic that you're not going to get the kind of results that you get out of regular cover cropping easily with interseeding. So here's some interseeded white clover with squash that where the clover was put in early, and it's pretty competitive with the squash. They still ended up getting some squash, but so yeah. Anyway. So now we're going to move on to talking about the different kind of directly, and I know we're kind of covering some of the same things from multiple angles. Essentially, I don't know. Essentially, I was thinking to give different ends to thinking about this, because you really do need to think about it from a lot of ways. And here we can see what are ways of killing cover crops of winter kill, tillage, tarps, roller crimping, and they're all using a different mechanism. So winter kill is just cold temperatures are killing the crops. Tillage is the soil disturbance, essentially like roots drying out. Tarps are starving the plants to death from lack of sunlight. And a roller crimper is kind of its own thing, but it's also dehydrating the plant by breaking the stems, done at very specific times in the life cycle of the plant when it's kind of vulnerable to that. And then we'll also talk about there's cover crop mixtures where you have a mixed sort of termination, where you might have one cover crop that terminates this way and another cover crop that terminates another way. So the benefits of winter kill termination is that you don't have to do anything. And you can if you get stuff in early, you can get a good amount of organic matter added to the soil. It's good for biennial weed control. You can close down on things like shepherd's purse and other fall sort of overwintering weeds. And the field is ready sort of as soon as possible for cash crops. And now this is going to be ideal for very early crops. And it's also, when we talk about mixed terminations, something like an oat nurse crop where the oats die and your overwintered crop that's a little more slow growing is ready in the spring. Here we have a picture of a radish bowl. It's just great. The drawbacks is that you have, pretty minimal soil protection in the spring, but still a lot better than nothing. You're not going to get any nitrogen contribution from winter kill cover crops to your spring crop. Whatever nitrogen was there either got turned into organic matter, which is great. You will get nitrogen from that in the long run, or it's leached out. And generally, I would say you still need to do some sort of weed control in the spring. It's not like you can just go transplant straight into the winter kill cover crop, unfortunately. So when we look at tillage, which really, I think can be anything from like this. You can do tillage with a shovel, but it's a lot of work. to all of your regular tillage. It's really, the thing with tillage is that essentially all of our crops have been bred to work in tilled systems. A lot of our like everything is made for tillage. And so you can have a lot of confidence that things are going to work as you kind of expect them to when you use tillage as opposed to some of these other systems. And the tillage will also aerate the soil and really jumpstart the microbiology. So you'll get earlier nitrogen mineralization from organic matter. The soil will be warmer. And you'll have a nice seed bed from tillage for small transplants. It's a lot easier to transplant into tilled soil than untilled soil, and do direct seeding especially for small seeded crops. Yeah. So another thing that's great about tillage is you get that above ground biomass of the cover crop really mixed into the soil. So to some extent, that's going to counteract the increased organic matter decomposition that you're seeing from the tillage. So, yeah. The drawbacks, on the other hand, is that it's extremely disruptive to soil biology. It's going to kill lots of mycorrhizae, lots of earthworms, although a fair number of earthworms are below the sort of tillage zone. But it's just very disruptive. It's going to require a lead time from when you till to when you can plant your cash crops, and the soil is going to be really vulnerable during that time period, which we can get some really big storms in, say, early May. And so it's a downside. And also when you get to later, sometimes you're having to do multiple steps, to mow, say, a more mature rye or vetch. If you try and go over a mature vetch with a disc, it's going to just tangle up and be a big mess. And finally, incorporating the high carbon residues like a more mature rye can cause nitrogen tie-up and be an issue for nitrogen availability in the following crops. So thinking about tarps, they are a great way to kill crops if you have 3 weeks or whatever, and their benefits are that they're going to warm up the soil and dry it out, especially for early planting. That could be ideal there. Yeah. The drawbacks are mainly logistical. It's quite, we don't really have good systems to use tarps on very large areas. And then the further thing with tarps I haven't mentioned so far is that it's a lot of plastic and they're not infinitely reusable. And the research is still kind of ongoing as far as how much plastic is getting into the soil, but it's definitely some. And what happens to that afterwards is, not even just like, even from a high quality, good, multi-year tarp, there's still going to be some breakdown and some plastic getting into the soil. And we don't, that there's some plastic in every soil, whether you use tarps or not, but still trying to get a handle on what the environmental plastic pollution worldwide is affecting. So that's definitely something to think about with tarps as well. So I also want to talk about roller crimping. Just, it's not, the most common thing, but is something that folks hear about. And here in this picture, we can see where the stems are broken in this rye. The nice thing about roller crimping is that when it works, you can really get a lot of weed control for the rest of the growing season. You're keeping the soil really covered. It is like a permanent, it's basically just getting that straw mulch right in there. And the high carbon nitrogen, or the high carbon residues don't tie up the nitrogen because they're not sort of available to the soil microbiology in the same way that they would be if you tilled it in. And furthermore, you can, you kind of plant right away, although you do have to wait until, so it doesn't necessarily get stuff in earlier, but you don't really end up have any of that exposure of the soil to storms. On the other hand, it really only works for some crops, and I would say it only works some of the time for some crops. So it's something that, if it seems cool, is definitely worth experimenting with, but not something that, unless have a system that works in your farm, it's not something where there are sort of recommendations that you can get from extension where people will say, here's how you do it, this is the yield you can expect, et cetera, et cetera. It's definitely something that has to be kind of tailored to individual farms. The timing is a little bit tricky, and basically you're really limited to only very large crops like tomatoes, squash, that sort of thing. The residues are also really great mouse habitat. So that's a downside that you'll hopefully the mice are just eating lots of cutworms or whatever, and not chewing on your squash. And you definitely do get some seed, like we were talking about before. It doesn't tend to be super voluntary during the year after roller crimping. But if that's a field that you don't want there to be a rye cover crop the fall after that, then roller crimping is probably not a great idea because there definitely will be a rye cover crop there the next fall. And any weeds that do get through the roller crimp residue are really quite challenging to deal with. So a thin roller crimp stand is going to be really not fun. So finally, just talk about mowing a little bit as a tool that's used commonly as part of termination. Is commonly a way to keep your equipment from getting jammed up, and also a way to control seed set. If you have different cover crops that are going to set seeds at different times, it can be nice to mow that. In this case, you'll typically get a fair amount of regrowth after mowing from cover crops. So when we think about mixed cover crop terminations, it's a way to kind of think about how to get the timing of a mixed cover crop. Because you might want, say, a legume grass mixture in the fall, to get the grass really growing quickly and the legume overwintering and growing in the spring. But whether that's using an oat, it's going to winter kill, or something like a rye where you might want to mow it before coming into to stop the rye from setting seed, but then let like a vetch or crimson clover keep growing after that. And often people will like to mix radishes in to crops to get a little bit of that benefit. But you have to be careful not to put too much radish seed in because then you'll just get a field of radish. And so you want to limit that to a couple pounds per acre, especially in the mix. So, different cover crops have really different growth habits. And you want to kind of think about that in order to get the most out of, your particular cover crops. And then just one note here is that a lot of cover crops also have varieties that are grain varieties or forage varieties. And as a general rule, those aren't going to be as good for cover cropping. They're often not as vigorous. It might be a variety of oats that is very delicious to cows, but doesn't grow as quickly, which is great for cows, but not as great. And so typically you're actually, you're not going to lose much by getting the variety not stated cover crop options on your farm, unless you're really trying to like get into some of that stuff. There are, something if you want a rye that's going to flower a couple weeks later, like that's something that you can get, but it's not necessarily an easy place to get into to start. So I just want to go through we touched on this a little bit before, but different, we're going to start going through more of the cover crop types. And so here we have our winter kill cover crops that we mentioned before. And again, to note, be careful with the brassica cover crops, especially overwintering brassica. If getting enough time away from brassicas can be a challenge for mixed vegetable farms. And so there are some really great things about brassica cover crops, but they can be a little bit tricky to integrate on vegetable farms from a crop rotation point of view. These all do great together. So for oats, they grow quickly in the spring and the fall. They're not going to produce seed if planted after late August. But you don't want to, if you plant oats in July, then you're going to need to mow them or something to prevent them from setting seed by the end of the fall. And they're pretty easy to kill if you need to. We've got our radishes with so the radish actually has, this is just a note, which is they have a big fleshy root, and then they also have a tap root that goes down below that. So the fleshy root at the top is going to really open up that top of the soil, but then their long tap root is going to be great for bringing up nutrients from lower down and penetrating, kind of below your tilled layers as well. So like, it's not just where the big radish root is that's benefiting the soil by doing sort of up and down nutrient cycling. And as I've said, it's probably the most delicious cover crop, so that's something that's going for it already. The other ones are, not terrible maybe, but this is a good one. So I've included some summer crops as well here in the winter killed stuff, just to touch on them. But so Sudan grass, sorghum, Sudan grass, sorghum, everything in the sorghum-ish sort of thing. Really fast, hot temperature, very drought tolerant cover crops that you can get. You can get a lot of biomass from in a couple months in the summer if you have that window. And they actually are one that can be killed by low mowing, especially if you get some rain after that. They don't regrow as well as a lot of grasses from the very bottom if it's so that's not 100%, but at the same time they're fairly tough residue, so it's not it's something where you're going to have need some time to break down. It's not something that you can till in and go in a week later and have a pretty clean field, which is different than a buckwheat, which is pretty soft, fiber, not fiber free, but pretty juicy cover crop that can be chopped up pretty easily in the soil and breaks down fairly quickly, as long as there's some moisture in the soil. The other thing that buckwheat is especially great for is insects love it. They love it so much. So it can be it's great for beekeepers. It's great for beneficial insects. That's the nice thing about it. It's, most of our winter cover crops they're either grasses that aren't really that good for insects, or you have a little bit of a window with the legumes in the spring. So when we think about hardy cover crops, sorry, this is not the right things here. So we're just going to skip this slide. I copied it wrong. But we have our mustards or brassicas that are going to make it through the winter. And so the thing with the mustards is that if you plant them early, and they start flowering, they don't make it through the winter as easily. And some mustards, they're a little bit, well, historically have been a little bit borderline to make it through the winter in our area, the varieties that are used for cover crops. I suspect that if our climate change stuff keeps going in the way that it has been, they're going to very consistently overwinter. But you do want to plant them, you want them still to be in the vegetative stage. So that's probably planting in September. They can be mixed with rye and vetch pretty well. So, again, challenging for brassica pests. And they suppress disease. I guess like they're sort of antifungal. The brassicas in general, they don't have, well, not in general, brassicas don't have relationships with mycorrhizae fungi, so they can really go hard on the like antifungal stuff coming out of their roots because they don't have to keep any fungus happy. Um, and so that can be a beneficial thing just to have in the rotation. And yeah. Uh, Here we're going to talk about everyone's favorite cover crop, rye, which is it's everyone's favorite cover crop because it really grows when they're the only cash crop that would be out there would be garlic. And so you can plant it really late, in really up to the 1st of November pretty easily. And I don't think it's crazy to plant it the first couple weeks of November. Like it's not gonna do much over the winter, but it'll be there and it'll start growing fast. Rye that was planted in November last year, I'm sure is growing this week out in the fields. And that's not the case for basically anything else. That's not the case for, the pasture grasses or anything like that that are still going to be dormant. The rye will really, it'll wake up quickly and grow for a couple days. And, yeah, so it's great in that way. It's suitable for roller crimping if that's something that people want to try out. It's pretty hard to kill. So like tarping, you have to really tarp for a while with the but again, it's something that is a common cover crop that you're going to be able to get. If you're new to cover cropping, it's something that your neighbors are going to know about and have thoughts on how to do it. It's going to fit with all the equipment that's available. The seed is cheap. So there's a lot of advantages to rye. And a lot of those advantages are also true for wheat and triticale, which are like essentially just like a little bit of a different angle on rye. They work very similarly. Typically the seed can be a little bit more expensive, but not, until you're at big scales, it's not a huge, not a big thing. But one of the nice things to think about with wheat and triticale is that the typical varieties that you get for cover crops are going to mature a little bit later in the spring. So if that's something, and I find they will line up a little bit better with vetch than rye. So if you're going to plant a small grain with vetch and want to keep it there until the vetch is flowering to get that nitrogen, with a wheat, like you maybe don't need to worry so much about it setting seeds ahead of time. In the way with a rye, you probably want to mow the rye if you're going to keep the vetch out there longer. And the rye will grow back after being mowed, but it'll still set back the seed time a little bit.
Arthur, there was a question about rye.
Yeah.
Is it true that it is allelopathic and prevents germinations of other maybe weeds or direct seeded crops?
Yeah, so it definitely does have some allelopathic tendencies, and you'll get, typically like a stand of rye cover crop can be very clean in the spring. And I think that's something that people certainly, when you get into roller crimping where you're killing it and then going right into it, is an issue. But with the allelopathy is not something that is too concerning if you're have the couple weeks between tillage and catch crop planting. But it's, I would say it definitely, it's always a little bit tricky to even if it will not have like shepherd's purse or mustard, there won't be weeds from the fall that make it through.